I'm here to teach you camera basics, and pretty much since the invention of the camera, there's been 3 things that everybody has to learn to be able to get the photos and the film that they want. And those things are ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Let's do this. Welcome back, or welcome for the first time. If you love learning about filmmaking and photography, please hit subscribe and tap on that bell right there. The first thing we're going to talk about ISO, which is the sensor's sensitivity to light. The more I increase the ISO, the more sensitive the sensor becomes to light. So if I need a little extra light, I can bump up the ISO and get it. Now if you go too high with the ISO, then you're going to get a bunch of grain. Here's a few different shots. We're going to start with 400 ISO, which is the native ISO of this camera, so it is the most ideal ISO for me to use. So first we're going to start with 400 ISO, and this is 800 ISO, and this is 3200 ISO, and now you see as the ISO increases there's more and more grain. Here is 6400 ISO, and here's 12,800 ISO. As you can see, the higher the ISO, the more grainy it becomes. You're adding more and more artificial light. So the lower the ISO, the cleaner the image. Next up we have the aperture. The aperture allows more or less light to reach the sensor with the aperture adjustment on the lens. Now the aperture also controls the depth of field and is measured by f-stops. Now the lower the f-stop, the shallower the depth of field and the more light the lens lets hit the sensor. So here is a shot at 2.8. This is f2.8. Wide open is what they call it, and this is letting the most amount of light in through my lens. Now this is f6, and we have one at f12 right here. Now as you can see, the lower the f-stop, the shallower the depth of field. That means the subject is in focus and the foreground and background are out of focus. The higher the f-stop, the longer the depth of field, which means there's more things in your view that are in focus. Now, when you increase the f-stop, it lets less light in. When you lower the f-stop, it lets more light in. So you're going to have to adjust your shutter speed or your ISO to compensate to expose your image properly. And after you do this for a while, you'll kind of get used to it and it'll feel really natural to you. Shutter speed is extremely important because it determines the speed at which your shutter opens and closes, which determines the amount of light that's let in to your camera. If it's a really bright day, I'm going to want a faster shutter speed. I'm going to want it to be up there so that I can make sure that only a little bit of light enters so it's not overexposed. If it's really dark outside or it's getting towards the end of the day, you're going to want a low shutter speed. Now the thing is, if you have a low shutter speed, there's a lot of motion blur, as opposed to fast shutter speed, which is very sharp, it captures the moment. Here's a picture taken at fast shutter speed. As you can see, it captures the moment in time, it's crisp, there's no motion blur at all. Here's with a longer exposure, a slower shutter speed. As you can see, there's a lot of blur, there's a little bit of trails. That's kind of the result, the difference between the fast and the slow shutter speeds. The shutter speed is different with videography than it is with photography. So if I'm with videography, you always want your shutter speed to be double your frames per second. That's right, your shutter speed should always be double your frames per second. So if I'm shooting at 24 frames per second, it should be around 50. If I'm shooting at 60 frames per second, the shutter speed should be 120. And if I'm shooting at 120 frames per second, the shutter speed should be at 240. This allows for natural looking motion blur in cinema. So if you make the shutter speed faster than that, it's gonna capture more of the moment, less motion blur. So that works good for like action scenes and stuff like that, but it's just not gonna look right in your everyday cinema. I'm so glad that y'all joined me again. Please subscribe, leave in a comment below if there's anything you would like to know in episode 2, or you just want to say hi. I love talking to y'all in the comments. Anyway, create, please create, peace. Oh, one more tip for you. I know some of you are probably thinking, how can I be at like 50 shutter speed in bright daylight without having an overexposed image? Well, that's where this comes in. This is a variable ND filter, and you put it on your lens and it's like works as adjustable sunglasses for your lens essentially. So that way you can keep the shutter speed at 50 without having overexposed image, which allows you to go down to like f2.8 or f1.5 or whatever you're doing and have a shallow depth of field in bright sunlight. Peace, guys. See you soon.